Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brandon Hill. I'm the Marketing Director here at Fuel Cycle by Passenger. I appreciate everyone joining us today from the various parts of the country for 14 Principles of Building a Better Customer Journey, presented by folks here at Fuel Cycle by Passenger and our guest presenter, Annette Franz, Customer Journey Expert. This is the second time we hosted a webinar with Annette. We had a webinar on the biggest challenge facing voice of customer programs back in March, which I encourage everyone to take a look at after today's webinar, which you can find at fuelcycle.com. Navigate to the resources section, and it will be in there. I am joined today by Rick Kelly, Vice President of Client Services here at Fuel Cycle. Rick is one of the, and those of you that have joined us before, you'll probably hear a little bit of a repeat, but Rick is one of the smartest people and most knowledgeable people in this industry that I've had the pleasure of working with. So it's always nice to get his expertise here on these webinars. Rick has spent most of his career in the market research industry, working closely with clients and operations teams to ensure clients' needs are met, as well as a variety of other accolades. A couple items of housekeeping real quick. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will get a copy of the recording. You can also view the PDF of today's slides in the handouts section in the GoToWebinar control panel. In the control panel, you will also find a Q&A and chat box. Feel free to send questions in either of those areas, and we will collect those for the Q&A session at the end. As I mentioned, today's host is Annette Franz, a customer experience consultant. She is the author of the popular blog CX Journey, where she shares 25 years of experience and passion for teaching companies about customer experience and helping them understand the importance of the employee experience to a great customer experience. She has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential tech women on Twitter by Business Insider and by several other organizations as a top influencer in customer experience. So along with Rick, we've got two very knowledgeable presenters today, and I'm sure that everyone will get some good information out of today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Annette. Annette, take it away and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And thank you again, Brandon, for having me a second time. I enjoyed doing a webinar with you back in the spring, and I'm happy to be back again talking about my favorite topic, customer experiences. If you know me or have seen me out there in social media, you know that customer experience is my favorite topic in the world. And I could sit and talk about it all day. So it was a real challenge to, narrow down the topic to journey mapping, which is my second favorite topic, number one topic within customer experience to talk about. So it was a real challenge to, sort of pare that down to 25 minutes of great content for you guys today. So the agenda for today, going to talk real briefly about why you should journey map, and then I will jump right in and talk through those 14 principles of customer journey mapping, and then I'll hand it over to Rick to talk about this customer-centric world. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So let's start with why journey mapping. Why should folks be mapping the customer journey today? Journey mapping really is a necessity if you want to understand the current state of the customer experience. I've been known to say you can't transform something you don't understand, and it's true. How can you know what to fix or what to redesign or what to improve if you don't really have a solid understanding of what it is today? So in order to redesign the experience to that desired future state based on what our customers are telling us, we need to map the current state. And a lot of times when we talk about journey mapping, it's not even so much about the map as it is about the process, the discussions, the sharing, the understanding, all of the different reasons for mapping and the things that we can do with the map that are really the learning and the experience for us, and how we're going to really start that transformation. So let's go ahead and move on to why we map customer journeys. There are a ton of different reasons. I've blogged about this a couple of times. I think I've come up with 30 or 35 different reasons, but I'll give you sort of high level here, and just know that there are a lot more reasons than what I'll list out here. So first and foremost, we want to map so that we can build empathy for the customer and really understand the customer and understand what the customer is going through as they're transacting or interacting with us. We use journey maps to gain executive buy-in and executive commitment to our customer experience initiatives and improvement efforts. We use journey maps to break down organization silos, and I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through my 14 principles. We also use journey mapping. We also map because we want to shift the organization thinking from touch points to journeys, and also from that inside-out thinking to more outside-in thinking. And we want to help employees understand the experience and how they impact it. This is really key. If our employees don't understand how they impact the experience and the experience that customers are expecting, then we're not ever going to be able to deliver the experience that we ought to be delivering. So given all those reasons, it's really no wonder that journey maps are often referred to as the backbone of customer experience management. They're really a critical tool in your customer experience toolbox. So the good news is that everyone seems to be mapping. You know, when I first started writing and talking about journey mapping, probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago, you know, people would be like, what is that? Why is that even important? What does that mean? What would that do for us? And the good news is today it's a very well accepted tool within that toolbox, but the bad news is that not everyone's getting it right. As a matter of fact, really only a few folks are. And that leads to a lot of unnecessary frustration and a lot of times the sentiment that the maps are worthless and that they're not actionable. So when you hear people say that maps are a waste of time and they're not actionable, you know that really something is missing, something isn't being done correctly. Just because you've created the map doesn't mean it's done. The map doesn't do the work for you. It's a tool. It's a tool. It's just a picture at that point, and hopefully one with a lot of information for you. You know you've got to act on the map, but you can't. It's almost like you're paralyzed. You don't know how or what to do. So given that, that's why I'm here to tell you about the 14 principles of journey mapping. These principles will ensure that your maps are actionable and they're acted upon. There really can't be any sort of customer-driven transformation without adhering to these rules. So let's go ahead and jump in and get to principle number 1, which is all about focusing on the customer. Who is your customer? And in that regard, we want to make sure that we map at a level that is in enough detail, not just the map itself, but who the customer is to really be able to understand and to make an impact. So what we want to do is we want to focus on customer personas and not targets. And I'll talk about that personas a little bit more in a second. But you know, a lot of companies talk about target customers, and target customers are, you know, if you think about marketing and advertising, they're, you know, hey, we're going to target males 18 to 49. Well, that's just really too high level of a descriptor of your customers to be meaningful, and especially not useful when it comes to customer experience innovation and design. Targets don't really provide the details that you need, like what are the customer's needs, what are the customer's goals, attitudes, behaviors, emotions, those kinds of things. And they're really just too far from reality and from what the customer is doing to be helpful at all when it comes to customer experience design. Personas, on the other hand, are much more personal, and they shift everybody from that target level of thinking to a more actionable definition or view of the customer. So if you want to really get to a more personalized experience for your customers, you've got to do your homework and develop your personas. And then start mapping at the persona level. Principle number 2, you've got to outline clear goals and objectives. Just like any other research or any other project you're doing, you've got to start from the beginning and know the why. Why are you mapping? What are your objectives? What value does the map bring to the organization? What are your intended outcomes? What changes are you going to make as a result of the findings? And even more important, are you prepared to make those changes? So along with objectives, you've got to define your success metrics as well. What needs to happen in order for those maps to be successful? How will you measure that success? Principle number 3 is tied very closely to that, and it's also an important one to keep in mind. We need to clearly define the scope of the map. What are you mapping? So Which persona are you mapping? What's your start and end point of the of the experience that you're going to focus on? Are you mapping an interaction? Are you mapping a transaction? Will you be focusing on the physical or emotional factors driving people's behaviors? Will you include front stage details, backstage details? What are you going to include? What is the scope of the map? There are a lot of different factors that fall under the definition of scope. This is really going to help us determine the best framework for us to use for mapping, so you really have the right information to make the map actionable. There are a lot of different frameworks out there that you can use, but once you define your own objectives, your own scope, and what you want to get out of it, then you'll likely create your own framework. So you make sure you have the right information in the map for you, for your purposes, for the jobs that you have to do in terms of redesigning the experience. All right, principle number 4 is to be sure that you map from the right perspective. Obviously, this is the customer journey that we're talking about, so we always want to make sure that we map from the customer viewpoint. When I'm in a mapping workshop, I typically tell my participants to use I phrases when they're talking about the steps in the journey. So rather than saying, we sent an email, we have participants say, I received it. So put yourselves in the customer's shoes and say, I received an email, I opened it, I saw my order was delayed. So it really puts the participants in the customer's shoes. So actually, let me take a step back here for a second and talk about the process that I use for mapping. So you're probably going, well, why are the participants saying I? Why aren't customers saying I? Well, typically the process that I use when I start mapping is it's called an assumptive map. And that means what we do is we gather a group of internal cross-functional stakeholders to really develop a straw man map of the experience. A lot of these folks are customers themselves. They've heard the feedback from customers. They've spoken to customers. They know what customers are going through. And it's really a starting point. And it's where a lot of this breaking down of the silos and the collaboration and all the things that I'll be talking about really starts to happen. It's where the magic starts to happen. Now, don't get me wrong. You can map right out of the gate with your customers. There are a lot of different approaches to mapping, but this is my preferred approach, is to start with that assumptive map that's built by your internal stakeholders. And I'll take you from point A to point Z here in a second. So my 14th principle will tie it all together very nicely. But this is where I typically start. So as we go through these, just remember that I'm talking about this from a reference of an assumptive map that we're creating here. So as you take this approach, you want to ensure that the mappers are mapping from the customer viewpoint, not from the company's. Because what ended up happening, if at this point you're mapping from the company's perspective, you will perpetuate that inside-out thinking. And inside-out thinking is really, we know what's best for the customer, we know the customer is best, and making decisions without actually talking to or considering or bringing in the customer's viewpoint. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to perpetuate that inside-out thinking. We want to bring in that outside-in thinking. If we perpetuate that inside-out thinking, we're never going to accomplish what our maps really need to do, and that is obviously to understand the customer's experience, what she goes through, what she feels, what emotions we elicit or are elicited during that interaction, and more. So principle 5 is to actually map the customer journey. And while this might sound very similar to principle number 4, it's not. It's completely different. This is what I'm referring to here is don't map the company's journey. Don't map internal processes and procedures. We want to make sure that we map what the customer is going through in the customer steps, not what the company is going through during that journey. Principle number 6 is to make sure that we map the jobs to be done, not life cycles. So when we map, we really our starting point is to think about what task is the customer trying to do, what job are they trying to do, what are they trying to achieve, what is this interaction or what is this transaction. When we start talking about life cycles, we're way too high level. We're way up there in the clouds, this 30,000-foot view, relatively speaking. Life cycle stages, buyer funnel, those kinds of terms I often hear people talk about customer journeys, and they mentioned those phrases. And that's great for, your marketing and sales folks when they're trying to target their, communications and marketing campaigns and sales pitches and those kinds of things. But they're really too high level and aren't the kinds of maps that we as customer experience professionals need and use to redesign the customer experience. They have their place. Lifecycle maps have their place. They're great for helping the sales and marketing folks, obviously nurture the overall customer relationship, but they don't get to the heart of what we, again, as customer experience, what we are trying to do, which is to redesign the experience that the customer is going through every day at the very detailed level. So piggybacking off of that, we need to make sure that we map at the right level, and that is principle number 7. And what this means is when you're mapping, you need to make sure that you map step by step. If you don't capture all the steps that are necessary and that the customer goes through, then we're missing something. We can't understand the journey and we can't fix it. You have to have enough detail to really be able to identify where things are breaking down. So we capture every step that the customer is taking, including handoffs and even those things that are outside of our control, because they all impact the experience. And what we need to do going forward is even define how we're going to mitigate those things, even those things that are outside of our control. All right, principle 8 is that you need to add data into your maps. We want to add data into our maps because that data will allow us to analyze and prioritize our touch points and our improvement opportunities. So bring in data like customer feedback, ratings, reviews, metrics, transactional data, interactional data, cost to fix, impact to fix, those kinds of things. Any kind of data that you can then analyze and use to prioritize how you're going to and where you're going to and when you're going to start your improvement opportunities. I don't think that anybody has unlimited resources in terms of budgets and human resources even to fix everything. So once we identify those key moments of truth for the customers, what matters to the customers, then we also need to analyze and prioritize those improvement opportunities internally as well. All right, principle number 9 is bring the journey to life. So by that I mean bring artifacts into your map to bring the journey or the experience to life for those who are going to use it. So examples of artifacts are things like invoices, statements, email messages, shipping confirmations, screen captures of the shopping cart, call recordings. Those are the kinds of things that you want to attach to the touch points or the steps of the journey so that as others are using the map or viewing the map, they know exactly what the customer is seeing and doing and using as they're taking the steps. And this is really going to help, especially when it comes time to identify what's breaking and what's not. And it's very eye-opening for others to see what we put them through, both the steps, and then once we add those artifacts and go, wow, we have them, go through 7 clicks on a shopping cart, those kinds of things. It's again, it brings the journey to life and really puts it into perspective for those who need to fix it. All right, principle 10 is that maps need to be collaborated and collaborative. So when we start with this assumptive map, again, it's being created through this internal exercise where these cross-functional teams are coming together to give input into the map. This is where the collaboration really begins. And this collaboration is really the root of breaking down the silos, getting buy-in from across the organization, and also, getting executive commitment and buy-in there as well. When we collaborate, we get input from key stakeholders so that we get sort of this holistic view of the experience across the organization. We get input from the frontline staff because they have a ton of knowledge about what customers go through, and they hear it and they see it, and so they have a lot to share about the experience. We get back office input to round out the details really of sort of the processes and tools that support each step behind the scenes. Again, not going into process mapping or anything like that, but when we sit there and we collaborate and we talk about and we discuss what's happening, sort of to my point at the beginning that I was making, sometimes the process itself of mapping brings the organization together, and this is where the magic happens. When we collaborate, during these sessions, we are also able to assign owners. Who's going to be responsible for each touch point? People can raise their hands and say, that's me, that's my department, which leads me to my last point on this principle, which is really that when we collaborate in building these assumptive maps, the organization learns that the experience doesn't just happen or isn't just owned or isn't just happening at this touch point. So I'll clarify that, what I mean by that. If a customer calls support, for example, they're calling support because there was an issue that happened somewhere prior to support. Now, granted, we do want to understand the support experience and that actual interaction with the support rep, but we also want to understand why the customer got there to begin with, right? And so when we are sitting here and collaborating with these cross-functional teams, what ends up happening is that sales and marketing might learn that they had some messaging or set some expectations upstream that really landed the customer in a call to support going, hey, why doesn't the product do this? Or hey, why doesn't it do that? Or, product hears that, oh, oops, we did something wrong with the product, and that's why they're ending up here in support. Billing, another example, they might be involved as well because they're going to find out that support is getting a lot of calls about certain issues or certain confusing items on an invoice. And again, that happened upstream. And so with everybody working together, we can certainly simplify the support experience and reduce the effort on the customer. The customer may never have to even call support. So there, you've redesigned the experience by solving the problem upstream. So those are the kinds of learnings and collaboration that happen during collaborating on these assumptive maps. So this is a very powerful benefit and principle of journey mapping. All right, principle number 11, maps must be communicated and shared. You can't really transform the experience without doing this. You need to talk about the maps. You need to share them to bring the customer and his experience to life, and really use the maps for what they were intended, and that is as a catalyst for your customer experience improvement initiatives. If you're doing it right, the map should drive change by telling you where the journey breaks down. So when we share the maps, we help employees understand why you're doing this. Again, getting that organizational adoption and this being focusing on the customer and the customer experience. It helps everyone understand the experience that the customer is going through. It helps them understand the experience that has to be delivered. It helps them understand how they contribute to the experience. And when we share it and communicate these maps to the employees, it really gives the employees a direct line of sight to the customer and how they impact the experience. And it's a training tool. Journey maps are excellent training tools, they're excellent onboarding tools, excellent communication tools, excellent teaching tools. So really the bottom line, when we share and we communicate, we really, what we're doing is we're educating and we're helping people understand so that they can act on their part of the puzzle or cake. All right, principle number 12, maps must be updated. So thinking that a map is one and done really relegates the map to that quote-unquote not actionable corner of the room. Maps have to be updated as the experience is updated, as you're making improvements, as the business evolves, as customers change, as new products are added. And there's a whole host of reasons why you need to update maps on an ongoing basis. They cannot sit on that proverbial shelf. I had a client tell me once that she had a map on paper that she crumpled up and shoved under her desk. So that map didn't go very far. There were no improvements made because it got stored under her desk. And this is really how people lose faith in what the maps can do. This is where they this is where they fail to see and realize the value that maps can bring. So really what you've got to remember to do is that as the current state evolves, as a result of changes that you're making, improvements that you're making, you need to constantly update your map to reflect the new current state. Principle 13 is that maps are not just for customers. What does that mean? So when we think about which or whose journey we're going to map, we need to really consider your entire ecosystem. So we need to really map journeys for all constituents' experiences. And what I mean by constituents is employees, customers, partners, franchisees, vendors, etc. Anybody that interacts with your organization, you ought to map their experience, ought to map their journey, you ought to map their experience. So journey mapping really isn't just for customers, which I think that is lost on a lot of people. So, anyway, so all of these constituents, they impact the customer experience. They all have an experience of their own with the organization, and their experiences really have to be great in order for your customer experience to be great. I can't express enough how the employee experience, for example, drives the customer experience. So if you take the time to map employee experiences and improve those, you will certainly see the resultant outcome in terms of improved customer experiences as well. All right, and the last principle, principle number 14, is that maps must be validated. This is really critical when you start with assumptive maps. Again, we've spent a lot of time internally building these maps and bringing what we know and think and have seen and have heard into building out the customer journey. But nobody knows that journey better than the customer himself or herself. And so we need to get the customer input and the customer validation on these maps. Why do we validate? Well, for a lot of reasons. First of all, again, because we've done the mapping work internally, we need to confirm that we've captured all the steps that customers take. We really want to identify any steps that we've missed because, again, nobody knows that journey like the customer. We want to identify the pain points. We want to identify areas of effort, whether it's high effort or low effort. We don't really care. We want to identify what the effort is. What do we make our customers go through as we have them interact with our organization? And we want to highlight what's going well as well. So, I know in customer experience we often focus on what's going wrong, but there are a lot of things that go right as well, and so we want to make sure we call those out here as well. We want customers to identify for us their key moments of truth. What are those make or break moments that keep them from moving forward in, whether it's to, did they hang up on support because it was a painful process? Or, make or break is also a little bit larger than that in terms of the relationship itself. If the experience is so bad at this interaction, what's going to keep them from coming back and continuing to be a customer of ours? And finally, we want to identify gaps. This is a big one. Identify gaps in internal perception of the experience. So we've now built this assumptive map. It's our perception of the experience based on all the things that I just mentioned. But this is a real eye-opener as well when we validate the maps with our customers. Sometimes we find that we've got it down pretty well, but other times we find there are huge gaps in terms of what we believe that experience is versus what the experience actually is. And so huge learning opportunities here. So you want to validate in order to confirm that you've captured the actual journey, the actual experience, the actual steps that your customers take to complete some task or do some job. Customers, obviously, they know better than you about their emotions and aspirations too, and we certainly want to capture those within the maps as well. So we want to ask both what drives them and what drives them crazy. Talk with them and really get them involved in outlining what their journey is. And again, we have to validate to ensure that we don't perpetuate that inside-out thinking. Rather, we want to make sure we shift that thinking to be outside in. We can't just stop our mapping exercises short of this validation process. There are a lot of different approaches to validation. So I don't know how many of you are mapping or have mapped and what your experience is and if you've gotten this far in your mapping process, but there are a lot of different approaches to validating your maps. You can validate both offline and online. So in terms of offline, you might host in-person workshops or focus groups. Online, you might use digital tools, qualitative and quantitative feedbacks or surveys, and online communities. Online communities are great for validating journey maps. So in a nutshell, what we do during validation is we bring multiple customers in to participate in a workshop, and they will probably be not just of one persona type, they may be of multiple persona types, have them walk through the assumptive maps that we've built, and then ask them to I'll have a circular conversation here, ask them to validate what we've done, ask them to change the maps to really match their own collective reality. Alrighty, and with that, I thank you again for your time. I'm looking forward to some Q&A at the end of this session, but right now I'm going to turn it over to Rick, who's going to talk about how online communities can help you do just this, impact the customer journey and be used to both create and validate your journey maps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annette. I found all the information you provided here really helpful and very interesting. While you're talking, all this talk of maps made me think of another story around maps that I actually just read. About a week and a half ago, there's an article in the Washington Post. There's an interview with Tim Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, and he talked about how when Apple Maps launched in 2011, it was received very poorly, and part of the problem was, flash forward to 2016, they actually have a great product, and Tim Cook talked about the process from going from a pretty rough product to a really great product was that they viewed maps no longer as a static thing that they could update every once in a while to this kind of living, breathing document. Roads change, construction happens, all these things. It became like a living, breathing thing, and it vastly improved the quality of your maps. It just kind of tied well to your presentation. I think especially Principle 12, where we talked about the need to be constantly updating and evolving customer journey map.
Oh, I love that. That's a great story that ties this all together from a couple of different angles, but very cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, real briefly, I want to talk a little bit about online communities. I think we're going to start a little bit by talking about history of customers and customer journey and kind of where we've come and where we're at today and how that's impacted the decision making that we have to take on our side. So I think everyone can relate, right? So we hear stories, it's 20, it's 30, 40, 50 years ago, brands were very, very much in control of the message, the product, place, positioning, price, all those things. They had it on their side. And it was consumers who reacted to what the brand did. It was kind of more of a one-way relationship there. There was a very direct path to purchase. The consumer, if we were to go back and map out a consumer path to purchase, it was probably much more linear and much more simple historically than it is today, right? And so what's happened is we look at times have changed. We have this proliferation of online tools and interactions, new sources, whether it's a new source of information, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, Amazon reviews or Friends or Google. The path to purchase has become a lot more convoluted than it used to be. And so brands no longer have the control over their path to purchase that they once had. In fact, it's dynamic, right? So people, they're moving throughout all these different sources of information, in order to get to actual purchase points. So that means really that in many cases, brands are left grasping for ways to engage with customers and understand where their customers are at the point of influence. And so as a result, when we talk about how we've gone from a kind of more static environment to a dynamic environment, that means the ways that we measure customer experience and customer journey, those can't be measured in a single point in time anymore. They have to be more dynamic than they have been historically in order to be successful today. And so really that leads us to building customer-centric organizations. In many cases, customer-centric organizations are organizations that are focused on understanding their customer throughout the life cycle of their journey. So every organization has to be customer-centric if they want to succeed. If we're not focused on customers, then we fail. And so as a result, the entire enterprise, whether you work in operations or customer support, marketing, or even if you're in finance, working as an accountant, you have to be focused on learning from and engaging with your customers in order to survive in today's environment. It's become that dynamic, it evolves that quickly that we need, really need to have a living, breathing tool to understand where customers are at throughout their life cycle. One of the organizations that does that with us today is Elle Magazine. So Elle launched a community with Fuel Cycle by Passenger about a year and a half, a little over a year and a half ago. And so they have, a community of several thousand women who are engaged with the brand. And Elle, as a result of having the community, is constantly learning from the customers. It's this dynamic, living learning tool, right? So they can see how people's preferences for online or offline media change, how their preferences in advertising or products change too. And Elle is a great example. It's a very fun brand to look at, but this applies to all the types of companies that we work with. And it's essential for not only media, but financial services, retail, CPG, travel, and pretty much any industry that you're in. You have to go back to these principles of customer centricity and understanding and being where your customer is in order to be successful in the long run. And I think that what we're trying to do is really bridge the gap between this dynamic customer environment and brands, and connect them directly, so you have real-time, living, breathing sources of customer information that allow you to make better decisions. And with that, I think we're ready for a few questions, if that's all right with you, Brandon.
Awesome. I'm ready. As a reminder, everyone, feel free to submit any questions into the question box or the chat box. We're monitoring both right now, so if you do have a question, send it on over. I've got a couple that have come through so far. Annette, I'm going to throw the first one to you.
All right.
Which is, which department or departments develop the personas that you mentioned?
That's a good question, and that's usually happens in the marketing department. Sometimes we see it if there's a UX group. They've already developed some personas, and a lot of times those personas are even closer to the level of detail and the types of personas that we need when we're mapping these journeys. But typically it's marketing, and if we work with marketing to ensure that they understand what the goals are and why we're looking for personas to be developed, then we can get them developed at the right level with the right amount of detail and information that we need for CX design.
Fantastic. Thank you. Rick, I think this one is going to go to you. Is there a specific moment in the customer journey that you feel communities are particularly good for? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So there's a large ecosystem of customer experience tools out there. And I think where communities really fit in is that they help brands build relationships with customers. Other tools that's more like point in time, post-transaction or something like that. It's very transactional, which isn't a bad thing, but a community really helps build relationships with customers over time. And I think, because of that, there's not necessarily a perfect moment in time. It's more you want that community as a layer and background for everything that you do.
Gotcha. Perfect. And so a follow-up question has come through kind of on the similar lines. Where do you see communities fitting into traditional CX approaches?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that communities aren't brand new, but it's still a new tool that's being developed. And I think that when you look at traditional CX approaches, a lot of it is like that, what's my NPS score today or at this store or in this place? And I think that the community goes beyond that. And again, it's that dynamic, ever-evolving source of customer truth.
Gotcha. Perfect.
I'll just jump in there real quick too. I think that communities are a great source, great tool for having a conversation too. I was just working on a project with a client recently, and as we analyzed the results and presented our findings and recommendations, one of the recommendations was to go and follow up with customers who had agreed to be contacted after the survey. And just as I'm listening to you talk, Rick, I'm thinking, wow, had they done some of this work through an online community, they would have been able to ask those questions, synchronously or asynchronously, and had those conversations. So community is a great tool for having conversations with customers and not having that lag time between when you ask a question in a survey and coming back and circling back with them several weeks later.
Yeah, that's a great point. Real-time customer information.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, Annette, I think this one's going to go to you. So speaking of mapping the employee experience, how does mapping handle dependencies between various departments, e.g. call centers and IT systems, support, etc.?
That's a great question, and that's not just something that is necessarily impacts employee journey mapping, but it also impacts customer journey mapping. So there's a couple of different ways that I would approach that. First of all, you may narrow it down in your scope, so that you don't have to have this whole big mangled, tangled web of different lines of information coming into your map. So you may narrow your scope so that it's a little bit more focused, so that you're focused on an interaction that's happening with a specific department, or you may actually open it up and have a framework that allows you to have different, and I'll call them line items or swim lanes, however you want to refer to them as, that captures the different channels and the different departments through which, whether it's employee or whether it's customer experience, that are impacting or through which the employee or the customer goes through a specific experience. So there's a couple of different ways to handle that. You can either narrow it down and really stay focused on a narrow scope, or open it up so that your framework incorporates all of that information. And it does sometimes end up feeling like a little bit more of an unruly map, but if it's done well and if you're using the right tools, you can certainly capture it all.
Awesome, thanks. So here's a really interesting question. Being that we're a B2B organization, I'm curious to hear your response on that. But any standout recommendations for complex B2B journeys? I know that's pretty wide, but it feels like there are notable differences versus general consumer.
Oh, interesting. I don't know necessarily that I have any different recommendations, whether it's B2B or B2C. They are different, obviously, in terms of, but you're going to start in the same place. You're going to identify your, what persona. I've mapped both. You're going to identify your persona, you're going to identify your scope, and then you're going to go from there. And I think the really important piece here and it's something that I only touched on briefly during one of the principles, was around the framework, right? So the framework is, what are the columns and what are the rows, or what are the swim lanes in your journey map, and how much information are you capturing in the map? For most maps, we want to make sure we want to capture at the very least what the customer is doing, thinking, and feeling, and then the rest of it is all icing on the cake, right? If we can capture other information, it's all icing on the cake. So I don't necessarily take a different approach when I'm doing B2B or B2C. Obviously the maps are going to look different, the personas are going to be different. There are different. There are different swim lanes, obviously, but if you define them, I don't know that I necessarily take much of a different approach, whether it's B2B or B2C. It's just really making sure you define it clearly at the outset.
Awesome. Rick, well, let's throw this one over to you. Do you think communities will eventually replace surveys?
That's a phenomenal question. I think this question came in from Parsan. Hope I got your name right. First of all, Parsan, call me. Let's talk. First of all, the short answer is yes and no. Surveys are a data capture tool, right? So you're collecting data in one form or another. And for that reason, I don't think that communities replace surveys. I will say in our community platform, we actually have really robust survey tools integrated into the community that allow us to run a lot of surveys. I think we have some customers that are collecting over several 100,000 survey completes every year inside their community. So what I will say is that I think that traditional survey methodologies, especially when it comes to measuring customer experience, surveys tend to be a little siloed. So you look at a survey data within a survey itself rather than looking at survey data, across multiple sources of information. And so when you look at what we're trying to do with our analytics and product stuff in our roadmap, is what we're building right now is we're building some tools that allow us to start measuring data across multiple surveys, right? So if you wanted to look at the way people responded to a survey 6 months ago to 3 months ago and today, we can track that at the individual or aggregate level all within our platform. And so I think that for that reason, there's an expansionary element that communities can have in the long run.
So I have the perfect follow-up question that came through. and you can't make this stuff up. But Annette, the question is, how does
I love it. I love it.
How does collaboration break down silos in an organization?
That is, you can't make that stuff up, can you? All right. Well, I think I talked a little bit about it during the principles, but I'll add a little bit more to it. When we collaborate, right, we're doing these assumptive maps. We're bringing in folks from the different departments, and a lot of times these folks don't talk to each other outside of doing these kinds of exercises, as sad as that sounds. And it's true. It really is true. There's no reason for me to go over and talk to this guy over in IT unless, whatever. And so when we bring all these guys together and have these conversations and frame it around the customer and talking about the customer and the customer experience, that is priceless. Just to have all these cross-functional teams in the room at the same time. I've done some great workshops where they just learn so much from each other. The other thing is the other way that we break down the silos with this collaboration is we realize that we need a lot of different, and I've talked about artifacts and data, but we need a lot of artifacts and data to bring into these maps, and there is not one single owner of any of those artifacts or any of that data, and so we need to be sharing those artifacts and those data with others in the organization, and that's where the breakdown starts to happen. And I am not, I make no assumptions that this is an easy process, right? I've been with organizations where breaking down those silos is just never going to happen. But I think at least getting people to talk to each other and work together and understand that if we work together for the benefit of the customer, it only benefits the organization in the end too. So yeah, I'm under no delusion that breaking down silos is an easy thing, but I think these maps and bringing people together, and again, like I said, sort of the exercise, the process of mapping is where the magic starts to happen.
Gotcha. Awesome. Okay, next question, Annette, I think this will be for you. What about quote unsexy products that don't drive interaction as easily for solutions like Community? If I was selling air conditioners or life insurance, how could a CX journey help?
It's the same thing, whether you're selling sexy products or unsexy products. Trust me, I've done journey mapping for unsexy products too, and it's really not so much about the product as it is about the customer, right? I think that's the thing that we really want to focus on is even if you're selling like the most unsexy thing, there is still a customer on the other end of that, and really that's the way that you will make this fun and awesome and delight the customer if you think about it that way. So I don't think that there's any limitations to what the product is or the service or anything. I think the key thing to remember is that this is about the customer and what his experience is interacting with the organization regardless of what we're selling.
Awesome. And then Rick, I mean, to the first part of that question, you might want to speak. Do you have any thoughts on the life insurance or air conditioning?
Well, first of all, I would take issue with anyone saying that life insurance is not sexy. Financial services and like insurance, product, actually a really important vertical to us. And so I think that we work with our customers to develop the right approach to Community, and have several very, very successful communities in that space.
Yeah.
So,
I think the bottom line is that manufacturers of air conditioners and people who create life insurance policies, the end result is that they still have customers, and that there's always a need to engage with those customers. So yeah.
Absolutely, and I've worked with some of the largest commercial air conditioner manufacturers, and then they focus on the customer regardless, so your point is spot on.
Yep. Well, on that note, I want to thank Rick and Annette. You guys have been awesome today. I hope everyone on the line appreciated the information that they got today. We'll leave Rick and Annette's contact information up on the screen for anyone who wants to contact them. Again, I mentioned that we did another webinar with Annette back in March. If you hit the fuelcycle.com website, as I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, and go to our resources page, you can view that webinar on demand at any time. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Annette, talk to you soon, and thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.